Hey everybody, welcome to Blender. Today we're going to look at downloading Blender and starting to navigate around it a little bit. We'll explain parts of the interface and some handy shortcuts to get you up and running quickly. This video is geared toward people that are just starting out or very new to Blender. So the first thing we're going to do is navigate to blender.org in our web browser of choice. And you can see there's a nice big download button on the home page, which will actually take you to the same place as this download tab at the top. We can see that the current version is 4.2, and there is a What's New button if we want to go explore the new features in this version of Blender. We can also go to the Features page if we want to browse Blender's features by topic to learn more about them in detail. There's also a support page, which has a helpful link to the user's manual. It is filled with great information on the specifics of the interface. And so now we're going to go to the download page, and you can see that it will default to the version you need for the operating system you're running, Linux, Mac, or Windows. I am on a Linux box, so that is what is showing here, but I can also download a version for a different operating system if I like. I'm going to go ahead with the default that it's giving me. And there's also a link here for trying the latest beta version, but that is not something I would recommend when you're first starting out, because while it does have the latest features, there are also sometimes some bugs. Let's go ahead and click the download button, and you can see here that Blender is now downloading. Go ahead and pause this video to install Blender on your computer and get it up and running if you haven't already. When you first open up Blender, you will notice the splash screen. It will show the version of Blender you are running in the upper right-hand corner. There are various options for opening a new file. I tend to just start with a general file, and that is most likely what you will want to use as you are starting out. You can also open an existing file by clicking Open, and if Blender was shut down cleanly, in other words, if it didn't lock up or crash, you can recover your last session here. It also has various links to the Blender website and some of the pages on it, such as the manual. Once you have saved files in Blender, though, this list will be replaced by a list of your recent files, which you can also open directly by clicking them here. The Donate and What's New button will remain visible. Donating is a really great way to support the software and to keep new features and releases coming if you are able to do so. You can either click the New File button on the splash screen or click outside of the splash screen to go directly into Blender. And this will be the same as starting a new general file. Before we get started, I'd like to point out that I am screencasting my keyboard and mouse clicks down here in the lower left corner in yellow to make it easier for you to see what I'm doing. One of the first things we're going to look at in the interface is the main menu bar up here at the top. It has your usual file options to create a new file or open either an existing file or a recent file, as well as save options. We have the standard save and save as, and we also have the save incremental option, which is a handy feature that lets you save a point-in-time file. Saving incrementally will append a numeric value on the end of your file name, so you will have a previous version of your file if you need to go back to it. Let's go ahead and save this file as example. Now let's make a change and then incrementally save it. We can see that the file name is now example1.blend. If you already have a number at the end of your file name, it will increment that value. Let's make another change and resave it incrementally. Now we'll see example2.blend. It's helpful to do an incremental save if you are getting ready to make major changes to your file, just in case you get unexpected results. Under the Edit menu, we have standard redo and undo options. We also have an undo history option, which will by default hold 32 actions that you can undo. You can configure this in your preferences, which we'll look at in just a moment. Be aware that configuring this to a higher value can negatively affect your computer's memory usage. Okay, now we're going to look at preferences. This is where you will configure a lot of your options. We aren't going to hit every configurable option, but we'll try to hit on some of the more useful ones. Let's start with the interface options. You can see here that you can disable the splash screen if you don't want to see it every time you open up Blender. You also have the option to turn off tooltips, which are the text captions that appear when you hover over a button or setting. I find them useful, but you can certainly turn them off if you like. You can also change the language for Blender. There are quite a few language options available. On the Viewport tab, you can change some of the display options and the frames per second that your animation will use during playback in the viewport. We also have the Lights tab. Studio Lights will allow you to eliminate the 3D viewport when you are in solid view. These lights will not be rendered, and the lights will follow your viewport orientation. You will have various options around these lights under the Editor section, and this will need to be installed before you can use it. This is not a lighting option I personally use, but I wanted to make you aware of it. Under the Editing tab, you will have options to control how your input will interact with various tools. Let's take a look at the Animation tab. One thing that is important to note here is the default interpolation. This will be the default mode that your animations will use. We'll talk a little bit more about these modes when we discuss the timeline. Next, we'll look at add-ons and get extensions. Add-ons are optional plugins that will extend Blender's functionality. For example, under add-ons, we'll look for and enable Node Wrangler. This add-on is useful if you spend a lot of time working with nodes. Another add-on that I usually enable is called Loop Tools. This add-on lets you do several cool things with your mesh, such as arrange vertices in a circle or bridge parts of your mesh together. Let's search for this here. We can see that it doesn't show up. So now let's go over to Get Extensions and look for Loop Tools. We find it here, and we must install it in order to use it. We'll see that once this add-on is installed, it will enable automatically for us. Let's go back to the add-ons and see that Loop Tools is now enabled. One thing of note on Get Extensions is that you have the option to install an extension either from Blender or from a disk. If you don't quite understand extensions and add-ons yet, that's okay. Just be aware of it. We'll demo an example in an upcoming video. On the Themes tab, you have several options to change the way the Blender interface looks. You have the option to change a lot of the color settings. If you click one of the colors, you will get the standard Blender color picker, and you can choose whatever color you like. It can be helpful as you're getting started, though, to leave the colors on their defaults. This is because as you start to watch tutorials, whether mine or others, it's a lot easier to tell if your screen matches the demo if your settings are standard. One setting I do typically change is in the node editor, the amount of noodle curving. By default, this is usually set to 4, and I update it to 0. Let's look at the shader editor so I can show you what this means. You can see that at 0, this connector is straight. But if we increase this to 4, the connector or noodle becomes more curvy. That is entirely a matter of preference, so feel free to adjust this or not. I will leave mine at 0. There are a couple of settings I want to point out on the Input tab. The first one of interest is Emulate Numpad, which can be useful if you are using a laptop that doesn't have a numpad built in. It will allow you to use the regular number keys to emulate the shortcuts that, by default, are mapped to the numpad. The other one here that says Emulate 3-button mouse will allow you to use a 2-button mouse as a 3-button mouse by using Alt and your left mouse button to emulate the middle mouse button. This will limit some of the other shortcuts in Blender that are already mapped to this key combination. The middle mouse button is used to navigate your view and change your vantage point. You can leave this setting off if you do have a 3-button mouse. The navigation tab has various options for changing the way some of the navigation works in Blender. We aren't going to go into detail here at this time. In the Key Maps tab, you can add to the predefined key maps. You can also edit or remove key maps. Additionally, you can change things such as which mouse button controls selection. When I first started working with Blender, selection defaulted to the right mouse button, but now it defaults to the left. This change was made in version 2.8, but they have left the ability to switch to the right mouse button selection if you prefer. The left mouse button is standard for other 3D software. Under the System tab, you can control things like the undo steps that we discussed earlier. You can also set a maximum memory limit for undo. The default 0 is unlimited. Global undo will allow you to undo actions that are not taken during edit mode, like object duplication or switching modes or settings. Let's take a look at the save and load options. You can choose whether or not Blender will prompt you to save an unsaved file on close. It's a good idea to leave this on so that you don't lose changes, but you do have the option to disable it if you like. You can configure the number of recent files that Blender will show in the Open Recent option. If you haven't saved any files yet, you'll obviously see no recent files. Otherwise, the files will appear in your File Open Recent menu option. You can also disable the autosave feature, but I wouldn't really recommend that either. You can increase or decrease the frequency of autosaves. With autosave on, not only can you recover your last session, but you will be able to recover an autosave file as well. Let's take a brief look at your file path options. You can set the default paths for fonts, textures, scripts, sound, and temporary files, as well as your render output and cache. The // indicates the current path where your blend file is being stored. Asset libraries are beyond the scope of this tutorial, but be aware that this is where you can add additional paths when and if you need to use them in the future. Your preferences by default will autosave when you update them. You also have the option to revert to the factory preferences. You can save your preferences, or you can revert to the last saved preferences. Let's go back to our main menu now. The render menu will let you render an image or animation, or let you view a rendered image or animation. You can also render the scene's audio to a file, and you have the option to lock the interface during rendering, which will allow the renderer to have more memory to use. The render settings are stored in the Properties editor, which we'll look at soon. The window menu gives you options for creating new windows or toggling full screen, as well as some workspace navigation and some screenshot options. The help menu will take you to some of the various Blender pages on their website, like the manual and the release notes. There is also an option to report a bug and to save the system info. The system info will take a snapshot of some of your settings and is useful to include when filing a bug report. Let's switch back to our 3D viewport, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the workspaces, which can be found to the right of your main menu items. There are several default workspaces, which are window layouts that have been predefined. They are usually geared toward a specific task like sculpting or animation. You can also create your own workspace by clicking the plus symbol at the end of this row when you have a layout that you like. Use your middle mouse button to move the row back and forth to access various workspaces if they don't fit in your menu bar. I spend most of my time in the layout workspace, and you do still have the flexibility in any workspace to add or remove windows and scale them to work for you. You can also change the type of editor that is present in any of your windows. We can, for example, add a geometry node editor here. Geometry nodes have a lot of flexibility, and I will be discussing them in their own video, but suffice it to say that they are, at their core, a modifier. We'll talk a little bit more about modifiers later in this tutorial, but we won't go into much depth with them in this video. I'll cover them a bit more in the modeling basics video that I have planned next. You can also join your areas by clicking the line where they meet and choosing Join Areas. We can then collapse either side we like. And now we're back to one large 3D viewport. We'll take a quick look at some of the other workspaces. Here's your modeling workspace, which defaults to the edit mode. This is the sculpting workspace. This and the edit mode are both available as modes in your 3D viewport. Here is the UV editing workspace, and we can use this to map the surfaces of a mesh to an image. You can see that while we don't yet have an image loaded, we do see the surfaces of our object flattened out in the default view. We can alter where this map lies to control where the image is projected onto our mesh. We have the shading workspace here, which can be useful when creating or manipulating materials. Your material nodes will show in the bottom section, and the 3D viewport will be on top. You will also have a file browser over here and an image editor down here. That is a brief look at what is available, and I encourage you to explore the other workspaces if you find them useful. Let's go back to our layout workspace. We're going to look at some of the editors that appear in the layout workspace in a little more detail. This large window, as I've mentioned, is the 3D viewport. We also have the outliner in the upper right, which, as you can see, contains all of the objects in our scene. When you first start a new project in Blender, by default, you will have a camera, a cube, and a light. Many times you will delete all of these objects to start fresh. You can do this by hitting A to select all, and then X to delete, and confirming the delete, which you can do either with a click or with the Enter button. Sometimes you will just delete the default view by clicking on it, hitting X, and then confirming. Usually, you will add your own lighting, but it can be useful to leave the default lighting in place until you get to that stage. If you do delete the camera, you can always add one or more cameras to your scene later. You will not be able to render without a camera though. Underneath the outliner is the Properties window, which is used to edit the settings of the active object. There are many tabs along the left-hand side of this editor, which represent the various categories of data you can manipulate. We will not go into depth with these, but I do want to give you enough information to help you find what you need as you progress with Blender. The Active Tool and Workspace settings will contain the settings for the active tool, which is currently the Select tool. The Render category will let you choose a render engine and adjust the properties as needed. The Output category controls a few things about your output, including the format of files and the output location. The Scene category will include things like which camera is the active one when you have more than one. It lets you add a background scene or adjust the measurement units, which are displayed by the grid you see here. By default, Blender will use the metric system, but you can set this to imperial and this will change the scale of those grids. Within that, you can also change the units of measure. For now, let's leave it on the more sensible metric system. The World tab lets you adjust the default shader for the world and configure a volume that is useful for creating mist or fog. You can also adjust the world settings within the shader editor by selecting World instead of Object. The Collections tab allows you to access and adjust the properties for the active collection. The Object category lets you see and manipulate the location of your selected object, set up relationships with a parent object, adjust the visibility and how the object is displayed in the viewport. The Modifiers category will allow you to add various modifiers to your object. These modifiers are non-destructive, at least until you apply them. Let's take a look at a couple, like the Mirror modifier and the Array modifier. The Mirror modifier will duplicate part of a mesh to the other side of it, and it's useful when you're working on symmetrical objects. The Array modifier will let you create multiples of an object, and you can create them along any axis or multiple axes. Each one of the modifiers does a different thing, and we'll go more in depth with them as we progress. The next tab is for your particle systems, which can include hair or any other collection of items that are emitted from a single object. The Physics tab is used for simulations, such as smoke, liquids, and cloth. We have a tab for Object Constraints, which will constrain the properties such as location, using a value or its relation to another object. The object data will vary depending on what object is selected. For example, when we select our light, we see that the icon changes to a light bulb, and we have various settings available, such as the color of the light and its strength. When we select our camera, we get a camera icon, and we can see values and options, such as depth of field and focal length. The clipping settings control what will show up in the render from the camera view. By default, it will not render anything closer than 0.1 meters or further away than 100 meters. These can be adjusted, but do be aware that the higher the range, the more processing resources Blender will use on your computer. These default settings are generally good for most purposes. The Materials tab will control how the surface of your mesh appears, and the Textures tab will allow for procedural textures. We'll look at materials more in an upcoming Modeling Basics video. The amount of tabs shown will also vary depending on what object is selected. For example, a camera will not have a material. At the bottom, we have the timeline. And I do want to mention that you can resize any of the editor windows by clicking on the seam and dragging it. The timeline will show your keyframes when you animate an object. It will allow you to scrub or manually move your place in the timeline if you want to inspect your animation. The default length for your timeline will be 250 frames, but you can adjust that here. Let's take a look at a quick animation example with our default cube. We must first select the object we want to animate. We'll keyframe the cube in its present location. Then let's move to frame 80 and adjust it a little. We'll move it up on the Z-axis and maybe rotate it on the Y-axis and scale it. Then we can hit the shortcut key I to keyframe it. Then we'll move further down our timeline and set up a new keyframe. We'll move it back along the Y-axis and scale it down. Hit our I button again to keyframe that. Then we'll take our first frame and duplicate it using Shift-D. And we'll move that keyframe to the end of our timeline so that we'll have a continuous loop. We can now play the timeline and watch our object move and grow bigger and smaller and then return to its origin. There's also a keyboard shortcut to play the timeline. While you are hovered over your 3D viewport window, you can hit the space bar. This will both start and stop the animation. Let's take a look at the interpolation modes we brought up earlier. The two common interpolation modes are linear and constant. Let's look at how each one of these affects our animation. We can see that when we use constant mode, our object will jump from place to place during the animation, rather than having a smooth movement. Now let's update that to linear. We can now see that our object moves at a consistent rate throughout the animation. We will discuss the other interpolation modes in the upcoming animation tutorial. I encourage you to experiment and get familiar with all of the options here. But do know that there will also be other controls to affect your animation speed of movement. And we'll look at these more when we discuss animation. Let's move our timeline back to 0 and move the timeline out of the way of our 3D viewport space. There are many additional editors available in the drop-down in the top left of each of your editor windows. For example, in this window, you can change the editor to the shader editor or the video sequencer, or to an image or UV editor. Here are some editors that deal with your timeline and animation. There are some scripting editors available here and also some data ones, which include the outliner and the properties editors included in the default view, as well as a file browser. There's also an asset browser that will be useful to you as you gain more experience with Blender, as well as the spreadsheet and the preferences, which we looked at under the top edit menu. Just know that we can get to it here as well. We will get to a lot of these in future videos. I just want you to be aware that they are here. And remember that you can change any of these windows to whatever editor you need at the time. If you find a setup that you like, you can save that to your own workspace. Let's go back to our 3D viewport. Let's add a window. We'll go to the upper corner of the window and just drag that little crossover to size it appropriately. We can add as many windows as we like. And we can open new windows either horizontally or vertically. We can set each window to a different viewing angle, which is also useful when you're modeling something. Let's hit 1 on our numpad to set this window to the front view, and then 3 to set this one to the side view. To use a shortcut on a window, not only does Blender need to be the active window, but your cursor needs to be hovered over the window you wish to affect. For example, if we hover over the Properties window, we cannot use the shortcut keys to affect one of our other windows. Now that we have a new workspace set up, let's demo how we would add this to our workspaces. We can give our new workspace a unique name by double-clicking the tab name and typing in our new name. We can delete this workspace if we don't need it anymore by right-clicking and choosing Delete. This is as far as we will go in this video about the editors, but hopefully that's given you a feel for how to add them, resize them, and what's available. Let's join back our created windows and take a deeper look at the 3D viewport. You will use this editor for most modeling and scene layout. If you want to do sculpting on your mesh, you can get to it either by clicking the sculpting workspace at the top or by clicking the mode drop-down in the 3D viewport and choosing sculpting mode. So let's talk a little bit more about the different nodes that are available in the 3D viewport. The object mode allows you to add and control objects. The little red and white circle you see in the middle is your 3D cursor. This will be where new objects originate when you add them. Let's open the Add menu by clicking Shift-A. Or you can use the Add menu within the 3D viewport. Let's use the keyboard shortcut because it tends to be faster. Let's add a mesh cylinder. You can see that this gets created in the same space where our cube is. So let's grab our cylinder using G and move it along the x-axis using X to move it away from our cube. And then we can see both our cylinder and our cube, which you can see in the outliner as well. So we can tell that they are indeed two separate objects. Now let's go into Edit mode, which we can either do with the top mode menu or by clicking Tab, which is the keyboard shortcut to move between object and edit modes. So now that we're in edit mode, let's add another object. Let's hit Shift-A to bring up our Add menu, and you'll see that there are a lot less options for what we can add than we saw while we were in object mode. This is because things like a light or a camera cannot be part of a mesh object. Let's add the Blender monkey head, known as Suzanne, to our cylinder object. Suzanne is Blender's mascot and a useful piece of more complex geometry you can use for testing. Let's grab our monkey head by pressing the G button and move it closer to our cylinder object. When we tab back out to object mode, we can see that this is all one object. The current object you are working with is displayed with a light orange border around it. You can see that it is also orange in the outliner. We can select an additional item by holding down the Shift button and clicking on it. The latest object selected will now get the light orange border, and the previously selected object will move to a dark orange. If we tab into Edit Now, we can see that both of the objects are now available to edit, but they will remain separate objects. In our next video, we will discuss a lot more about modeling and some of the cool things you can do with it. As I mentioned earlier, there is also a sculpt mode. This allows you to use some really cool tools to edit your mesh. This mode is only available for mesh objects, and we have a few other modes that are only available for mesh objects as well. The vertex paint mode will allow you to add colors by the vertex. The weight paint mode has some very interesting applications, allowing you to weight each vertex. This can give you a tremendous amount of control for some applications, and it's commonly used when animating the mesh to control which portions of the mesh are affected by a single bone movement. But there are additional uses for weight paint as well that we won't get into here. The texture paint mode is another mesh-only mode that will allow painting your mesh. Texture paint would use UV images, and your mesh must be unwrapped first. Using UV images is a more advanced topic that we aren't going to tackle in this video either. There is a particle edit mode that you will use to edit particle systems such as hair. There is also a pose mode available for your mesh once you have added an armature to it, and allows you to move bones to control your mesh's pose. There is also draw mode if you are working with grease pencil. For now, object and edit mode are your best friends. But it's also good to know that these other modes exist. I'd like to talk a bit about naming your objects. For example, we can see the default values up here, and it's pretty easy to tell them apart. But if we add another cube, then we have two cubes, one named cube and one named cube 001. So let's go in and modify our cubes a bit. Let's say we are modeling some different houses for a village. We can add a loop cut down the middle using Control R and then create a little roof over them. This is a very simplified example, but we'll make our second house a two-story one. We can extrude on the Z-axis to give it a bit more height. Now let's add another cube that we are going to use to model a stop sign. If we put this project away for, say, a month or two, and then we come back to it, it gets pretty difficult to tell which object cube 001 or 002 might refer to. Another thing we can do is add a new collection. We can nest these collections inside other collections or create them at the top level. For example, we can put our camera and lights into a collection, or we can move our simple little houses into a houses collection. This will allow us to disable the visibility or the rendering of an entire group, which we can also do at an individual level. We can collapse our collections to tidy our outliner. The eye is what we want to click to disable seeing it in the 3D viewport, which can be useful when you are concentrating on modeling a different object. The camera icon will disable it in the rendered image or animation, and let's take a look at that now. First, let's see our scene through the eye of our camera, which we can do by pressing 0 on our numpad. Now we are looking directly through the camera. And we can adjust our camera by bringing up our sidebar menu, which we do by pressing N on the keyboard. If we go to the View tab and click Camera to View, we can adjust the camera just by navigating in our viewport. Let's be sure to disable that so we don't continue to move our camera. Then we can render our image by clicking Render, Render Image. You can see now that the disabled objects can't be seen in the render. In addition to the sidebar that we just saw when we adjusted our camera, we also have our toolbar on the left-hand side. We can open and close this menu by using T on the keyboard. The Tools menu has several tools that are also generally available with a keyboard shortcut. The tools that are shown depend not only on what object is selected, but also what mode you are in. And we can see we have tools for Extrude, Inset, Bevel, Loop Cut, and more. I also want to mention some pie menus available in Blender. One of these is the Viewport Shading menu, which is brought up by pressing the Z button. This controls how your object looks while you are working on it. Material Preview doesn't do much for us here because we haven't added materials yet, so we only see the default white material. But when you have created and assigned some materials, it will show you those materials, but without your final lighting, so it may look a bit different from the full rendered mode. We also have Wireframe, which will show us the outline of objects and make the faces completely transparent. We can also see the rendered mode, which can get pretty resource intensive on your machine if you have a fairly complex scene. We don't have much to see in our scene here, but this will show you a fair representation of what you will see in your final render, and it's useful for adjusting lighting and materials. Another Pi menu we have available is Shift S. This will affect where either our 3D cursor is or where our object is. For example, if we click on our cylinder and choose Selection to Cursor, we can see that the object changes placement to appear where the cursor is, which is currently on the world origin. We can move the 3D cursor to a different point in our scene by using Shift and the left mouse button. We can return it to the world origin by using the Shift S menu again and choosing 3D cursor to world origin. Let's say a few more words about navigating the viewport. We can zoom in and out by using our middle mouse button. We can also change our view of the scene by holding down the middle mouse button or with Shift and the middle mouse button. This navigation can take a bit of practice to get used to, but it will eventually become second nature. Let's grab our monkey cylinder and go back into edit mode. Each one of the selectable points on our object is a vertex. At the top, on the left-hand side, we can see different selection modes. The first one is vertex, which will allow you to select one or more vertices within the mesh. There is also edge select mode, which will grab an edge or the space that exists between two connected vertices. And we have face select mode, which will allow you to select one or more entire faces within your object. These different selection modes also use the shortcut keys 1, 2, and 3, which apply to vertex, edge, and face, respectively. Let's select the face and extrude it, which is done by pressing the E button. We can also scale that face up and down using the shortcut key S. We can also rotate that face by using the R shortcut. We'll look at this a bit more in the upcoming Modeling Basics tutorial. But hopefully this gives you a taste of how to navigate the interface and some of the tools that are available to you. Before we wrap up, there are a few more features I'd like to share. One of those is Pivot Point. This controls the point around which your object rotates and scales. The default is Median Point, which means the middle of your current selection. So let's select all of our object and press R to rotate it. We can also rotate it on the 3D cursor. And when we are rotating the object, we can either click the right mouse button to switch back to the previous rotation of the object, or click the left mouse button to lock in that rotation. Active Element is also available, so let's click on a vertex to make it active, which will be displayed in white and then rotate it again. We can see how that now affects our rotation. Those are the major pivot point settings that I use, but feel free to explore the rest. We're now going to look at snap. You have a lot of options when it comes to snapping, and we'll only cover the default here, which is increment. When we enable this, then move our object, we can see that it jumps by incremental values. The increments that it's using are the grid marks you can see here. This can give you precision in your measurements and allow you to place things accurately. These default to 1 meter increments, but remember, you can change that under the Units section of the Seam tab in your Properties window. Another tool at our disposal is the Proportional Editing button. We'll enable that and grab a vertex on our mesh. Let's grab that on the Z-axis by pressing G and then Z. And we can see that the vertices around our selected point will move as well. If we turn proportional editing off and grab that same vertex and move it on the z-axis, it will only affect that vertex and the faces adjacent to it. You can use Ctrl-Z to undo anything in Blender, just like in most programs. Or you can use the Edit Undo or Edit Undo History menu to roll back changes, as we talked about previously. One other thing we want to look at are the various viewport shading styles available. These are the same settings that we looked at in the Pie menu triggered by the Z button, such as wireframe, solid, material preview, and rendered. It's also sometimes useful to turn on X-ray mode, which is to the left of the other setting buttons. This can be useful when you are modeling against a reference image behind your object, or when you need to grab vertices that are on both sides of your mesh. That's going to wrap up our introductory discussion of the interface. I know this has been a lot of info, but hopefully it's not too overwhelming. There are many things we did not go into since we were just trying to get a feel for the interface and how to navigate around it, but hopefully it was useful and helpful. You should now have a grasp of the interface, how to get it set up, and navigate around it some. My next video will be a more in-depth discussion of modeling, and we will tackle additional functionality as well as review some of the things we discussed today. If you have any comments or questions, be sure to leave them below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. Please like and subscribe to see more videos from me in the future. In addition to this beginner series, I will also be releasing some more intermediate material in the form of 10-minute or less tutorials, which will not go into depth but will cover a single topic or point quickly. The first one coming up will be a 5-minute tutorial for how to make and animate a lava lamp in Blender. Thanks so much for your time and attention. I hope to see you in the next video, and I wish you a very happy blendering.